Right. This short talk is about the professional user guide or the designer's guide, which has been prepared for HEMAC and SEDA, and is a wee bit late, and I apologize for that. It was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It was managed through the University of Strathclyde and written by ourselves, like John Gilbert Architects. The HEMAC network is, if you're interested in the health effects of buildings, it's worth knowing about that. The website is below. It was based on concerns about health from airtight homes with poor IAQ, indoor air quality. For those of us interested in this sort of thing, it was great because it was truly multidisciplinary. There were a lot of medical practitioners, academics, as well as designers involved. And it was global, so it was really interesting to meet people who knew different things from around the world. There was quite a lot of work, 2016, 2018, and then follow-on funding was achieved, and this guide is one of the things that was funded as part of that follow-on funding. These are the things we're writing about in the guide, really about reducing the pollutants that can cause trouble, about ventilating properly to dilute the problem, and to support people when they're in their homes to keep things on track. My take on it is that it's essentially a sort of risk management process. So number one is really about raising awareness. The biggest problem with this issue is that people aren't aware of it. So raising awareness is kind of the key thing. Source control is really about reducing the risks, reducing the problem. And then ventilation is really about diluting the residual problem. And then once you've got those numbers down, hopefully it's really a question of just managing and keeping an eye on things. And then there's obviously additional support. The problem is quite big, 36,000 deaths a year in the UK due to indoor air pollution, that's indoor air. And for reference, the number of deaths per year in Scotland is about 60. So across the UK, we're talking about over half the number of deaths that you would get every year in Scotland alone. So it's a big problem. And that's only the deaths. The bigger problem itself is really the amount of suffering that it causes for people who don't necessarily die from it, but are significantly impacted by what we're doing as designers and builders. So the premise is quite simple. We know that making airtight buildings is good for saving energy and for climate change, but we know that if it's done badly or without awareness of these issues, it can become a problem. And the guide has an equally simple premise, which is to demonstrate how to reduce this problem, how to reduce the pollutants, dilute properly using good quality ventilation, and then managing the issue. The difficulty is that when you try to prove that such and such a thing is bad for you, it gets very, very messy. And very difficult and very expensive. So we are relying on we're relying on the precautionary principle, which most of you in SEDA will be aware of. The good news is that it's actually relatively easy to avoid this problem. That's what makes it so frustrating. We could relatively easily not have this problem at all, but we do. And so it's hard to prove, which is bad. And if you go along trying to prove everything, you're going to struggle. But if you just avoid the problem in the first place, it's really not a big deal. So where do we start? We start with reducing the pollutants that we know or believe may be causing us harm. There's some controversy about the exact nature of this, but I'll just start going through those four. Very briefly, overheating and moisture aren't exactly pollutants, but you can treat them as such in the sense that too much heat or too much cold is a problem for health and can be designed out. And too much moisture or too little moisture, again, usually too much in Scotland, can also be a problem which we can design the problem away. So, and we can manage the problem away. We can support people to manage that. So we have treated them in this guide as pollutants in effect. The other thing that matters is that they both heat, so temperature and moisture essentially are the context within which a lot of other pollutants are affected or they're operating. So knowing about temperature and moisture anyway is useful. What we do in each section is we've done a wee drawing, or Drew has done a drawing of a sort of bad situation in a house, and then another drawing of a good situation in a house, illustrating the sort of things that you might do. Biological and natural pollutants include the ones you can see there in pink. The top lot are the sort that we naturally associate with hygiene. So, wiping surfaces, cleaning toilets, that sort of thing, not using the same board for chicken, raw meat, and that sort of thing. And then allergens, people know about these sort of things, animal dander, animal skin, animal hair, dust mites and pollen. So these are unnatural. They've always been around, but they tend to be made worse in houses where you don't have a good regime of hygiene and ventilation, and there's radon, of course. Another subsection is closely associated with combustion, or more accurately, incomplete combustion. So most of you will be familiar with some or all of those gases or particulates, and the solution, broadly speaking, is to not burn stuff in your house. And so there's a bit of detail about what you can do to avoid the risks associated with all of these gases and pollutants. And lastly, the trickiest one, which is VOCs and other what you might call modern chemicals. And this is a difficult one because there are literally thousands of them. So rather than try to go through each VOC or each other chemical, what we've done instead is look at the sort of things you might be specifying and the ways you could maybe avoid the problem. And there are many VOCs in many of these, and it's all mixed up, and it's very difficult to sort of disaggregate all of that. So rather than try and wade through it, we've just gone for the precautionary approach. And quite a bit of this last chapter on VOCs is also dealt with in a previous SEDA guide, which some of you may be familiar with. So once we have reduced the pollutants as far as we possibly can, we need to deal with whatever you've got left. Most people understand at some level that ventilation means providing fresh air, i.e. air that doesn't have pollutants in, and getting rid of stale air, i.e. air with pollutants in. So, and it's useful just to bear in mind that diagram on the right, which used to exist in the English and Welsh building regulations, which described how VOCs are, in fact, quite a serious problem, whereas my own feeling is that whilst people are aware of moisture as a risk, people know about mold in bathrooms, they're just not aware of the VOCs, but they provide almost a similar level of risk. The other issue which is worth mentioning is that we all know at some level that to provide ventilation, we have to have something that sucks out the air. So that might be a window, or it might be a fan, and in modern airtight houses, it's always a fan. We have to have, therefore, something that allows the air in, usually an open window or a trickle vent, and most people are dimly aware of those and how they work. But what is often what's often overlooked is that you need a path, a clear path from trickle vent in living room to fan in kitchen or toilet, and that's often overlooked. And you have carpets that go up against the underside of doors, and there's no way for air to pass through the house. So what the other problem associated with that is that you usually have different people in charge of each of those bits. The sparky who fits the fans is not the same guy who fits the trickle vents, and is definitely not the same guy who does the undercuts on the doors. So we need somebody to have an overview of that to make sure that that's working. The way that the chapter goes is that we simply talk about the broadly four different types of ventilation system. The ones at the beginning are useful to talk about, but they aren't in effect modern airtight homes. So we hadn't originally kept them in, but it was felt necessary to mention them. And then we simply talk about what that ventilation system is like, the pros and cons of it, and the way to best practice guidelines, really. And there is a differentiation between the way we're talking about it, because to me, there is quite a profound difference between decentralized extract fans, which is the third drawing, and then the various forms of centralized fans, which include ducts and so on and so forth. So those are described, and pros and cons and what have you. So ideally, we now know how to get rid of the problem mostly to begin with, and then how to ventilate effectively to make sure that you have more or less no problem left. We then talk a little bit about what it's like to be in the houses and how designers can help that. And there are two ways we can help that. The first is that the user guide, which is being probably published at the same time, talks about what occupants can do to make the air quality in their homes better. But it occurred to me that for that to be possible, you would have to have designed it to be possible in the first place. So I have taken Gronya's comments about what you can do in your own home and just made sure that there is a note for designers that, that essentially enables that to be possible. There's nothing more irritating than to be told that you should do X, but you can't actually do it in your house. So, that's just silly. So we've been through all of the guidance for occupants and put a sort of what would you call it? Corollary sort of design guide bit. And the second bit is, I think this will grow more monitoring of air quality. I think that will happen more, either through regulation or through people wanting to keep an eye on their own home. So we've talked about what you need to know, what are you trying to find out, what sort of feedback do you want, what are the sorts of things you might want to monitor, and what does good look like. So if you've got 100 of X, is that a good number? Is that a bad number? And so that's hopefully useful to people living in homes, but also useful to designers to enable them to, as it were, specify what shall be done in the house, to enable people to monitor effectively. There was a resources section, which I haven't finished, hence the really unimpressive graphic. And that's us. So as I say, the guide will be out in the next few weeks, couple of months. It depends a little bit on SEDA and other activities, but also on HEMAC and Strathclyde. Right, thanks very much. Stop share.